This November, Americans will be heading to the polls to elect their next president. And here in California, residents will be voting on several ballot measures that will test the strength of public sector unions here in the Golden State. So is California ready to go the way of Wisconsin, or will public unions flex their muscle once again and block reform? Joining me on set to discuss is Daniel DiSalvo, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, who has a new report out called The Nays Have It, When Public Sector Unions Win in California. Daniel, thanks so much for being here. And a little background for our viewers, California has a direct democracy, which means that we can vote in legislation through ballot measures. And Daniel, you took a comprehensive look at some of these elections and the role public unions play. What did you find?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on the program. What I found was I looked at every ballot measure that Californians have voted on over the last 30 years, since 1980, so 178 total measures. And then I tried to look at where did the unions, public employee unions in particular, play a part. And what I found was that on 40% of all the measures, the unions took a position for or against. And when they were opposing whatever the proposition was, 75% of the time it went down in defeat. On the other hand, when unions were trying to get something that they wanted, when they were supporting a proposition, it passed by a rate of 50%. So 50% of the time they wanted something, they got it. And even below those aggregate numbers, I looked at or tried to disentangle the, say, 15 most important propositions for the unions, and whether they were for them or opposed to them, where they really went all out and put in as much money as they could and mobilized their cadres of activists. And when the unions are fully engaged, they almost always win on those big ticket items.
Now, it's no secret how dysfunctional this state is. Would you say that the public unions, being able to kind of block some of these reforms is some of the reason why California is in such trouble fiscally?
Well, I'd say that certainly part of California's problems for its fiscal predicament, the causes are multiple and complex and have deep historical roots, so there's no single culprit out there. Does that mean that the public employees unions haven't contributed to complicating the situation and making it worse, and in some cases blocking reforms that may or may not have had the potential to improve matters? And I think the answer is a resounding yes. In that sense, the unions have used the ballot process in California as another institutional avenue to either stave off change or to try to get what they want. And in a sense, if you combine that with their, as some people here in the state have called it, hegemonic influence in the state legislature, that's a really big 1-2 punch.
Now this year, the two big propositions that are getting a lot of attention are Prop 30 and Prop 32. Now, can you describe a little bit what those two propositions do and what's exactly at stake with these two measures?
Well, the first is Proposition 30, which is a revenue raiser that would increase taxes on wealthier citizens here in California. And that's a measure that's backed by the governor, and it was the governor's team that went out and collected the necessary signatures to do this. The legislative language of the measure was drafted between the governor's office in negotiations with California's teachers' unions. And the basic purpose of that measure is to close a budget gap here in California so that the state can comply with its constitutional requirements to have a balanced budget. And the governor has framed it in part to enlist the support of teachers' unions as a measure that will stave off any cuts or dramatic cuts to public education. The second measure, Proposition 32, is a measure that's sometimes called an anti-special interest measure that would disallow direct donations to candidates and parties from corporations and public employee unions. But it's also in part a paycheck protection measure because it would prohibit public employee unions from using a dues checkoff mechanism to raise money for their members for political activity without the explicit consent of their members.
Yeah, You mentioned we have a balanced budget here in California. It's almost laughable because I think we're about 16 billion in the hole. But talk a little bit about just sort of the money involved, because a lot of the language that we've seen around these two propositions is, raise the taxes on the millionaires here in California to help fund education. And, there's this myth, I've seen the advertisements running here where, Prop 32 is bad because a lot of the corporations have exempted themselves from this. Is there sort of a myth that, it's big business that's pumping all the money into some of these ballot measures?
Well, what the report finds on the ballot measures is that in many cases, it's the public employee unions are the sole players on the field, or even when they have competition, they're outspending that competition by huge margins, not just 2 to 3 to 1, but in some cases 5 and 6 to 1. So what we see is in ballot measures where businesses really has a big stake, the measures tend to be much more competitive and the total amounts of money spent on the measures much less. Where unions feel that they have a lot at stake, the amounts of money are much larger and unions are usually outspending their opposition. If we're thinking about Proposition 32 in this fall's campaign, the total spending on this is going to exceed, supporters and opponents combined, easily supersede $50 million, which is a huge amount of money to go in.
Money. Yeah. We see with Prop 30 kind of raising the sales tax. We already have one of the highest sales taxes in the country. Governor Brown says this is going to be a temporary solution, but I think we all know no tax raise is really ever that temporary. The governor hasn't really even been able to work with the unions on some of the low-hanging fruit here, like as far as pension reform. He's got some of that done, but they seem completely unwilling to realize the situation that we're in. Do you see any of that coming to the table, or do you kind of see these ballot measures as kind of their last stand of, no, we can still get this money, and just completely ignoring the fiscal climate here in California?
Well, ultimately, unions are, and their leadership are elected by their members. Their job is to protect the occupational interests of their members, and those interests are no change. The status quo is relatively good in California. California's teachers are among the highest paid in the country. The pension and retirement schemes for many other public employees are quite generous compared across the nation. In that sense, their position is, well, we don't want to have any change. We want to get more revenue is going to always be the solution rather than any budget cuts that would negatively affect our members. So clearly for them, putting the burden on someone else is priority number one. Whether that will do any good for California's long-term budget situation is, of course, the subject of much debate. The problem, I think, for the governor is that even if Proposition 30 passes, is this really going to generate, there are many rich people in California, but is this really going to generate enough revenue to sustain the projected budget deficits, which are, as you noted, quite large looking out into the future? Or is this just a temporary Band-Aid on what is a real structural problem in California's budget process?
Yeah, and what gets me about this whole thing is the way that they framed it is, this is about education, this is about our children. We kind of saw the same argument when, I think it was Prop 98, when they designated 40% of our state budget to go toward education. What that's got in California, I think we're ranked 30th in the nation with our public schools. But is this really about the kids? You mentioned them protecting their interest, but do you think that people in California will actually kind of see through that kind of ploy this time? Do you think that the reforms that were done in Wisconsin maybe have kind of opened people's eyes, and that maybe California will actually wake up and say, this isn't right?
Well, I think certainly Wisconsin has raised the issue of public employee unions and brought it to national attention in a way that it had never been before. Public employee unionization was something that emerged out of the late 1960s and 1970s, and it really wasn't until the 80s and 90s and the last decade that they really fully blossomed into their full flower and their full power. And in that sense, the public, they'd been operating behind the scenes, and the public couldn't really see what was going on, partly because much of their influence is exercised through collective bargaining negotiations, which are private. And in that regard, I think Wisconsin has drawn national attention and could shift the debate, especially, I think, more on Proposition 32 even than Proposition 30. I think the incentives for the union on Proposition 30 are the California State Legislative Analyst suggests that only about 40% of the revenue raised under Prop 30 will actually go to education. The other 60% will be largely at the discretion of the governor. Now, the unions may hope that some of that may be used to shore up the pension system and other state priorities.
We talked a little bit about direct democracy here in California. I just wanted to show, this is our voter guide here in California. All these pages here on ballot measures. I probably won't read it. I don't assume a lot of people will. But do you think even if people are successful in passing, I think, Prop 32, kind of curbing some of these powers, do you think until we kind of maybe do away with this direct voting that the problem really won't go away?
Well, certainly it's a complicated situation in California, and I think the last 30 years have indicated that the initiative process or direct democracy process in California has certainly not always functioned as a tribune of the people or a way to directly express the will of a majority of Californians, and has really become just another institutional venue for special interests to do battle. In many cases, at the forefront of these battles, as I find in the report, is public employee unions.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining us today and for talking about this report.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
And you can read Dan's full report, The Nays Have It, When Public Sector Unions Win in California, by clicking on over to manhattan-institute.org. And for PJTV, I'm Alexis Garcia. Thanks for watching.